So one of the issues that we're wrestling with as a culture right now is the idea of free speech. It's nothing new, really. We've been wrestling with it for probably longer than most people realize. Because the Constitution enshrines it in the First Amendment as a freedom of speech. And yet it seems like in a lot of places that freedom is considered dangerous. So, for example, on some college campuses, or I was just reading an article from Politico about Seattle, where the anti-fascist, the Antifa group is trying to hold and keep out what they would consider nationalists or Republicans, saying that their free speech is really just hate speech. And this is what you saw on college campuses over the last year, specifically thinking of the Ann Coulter row, her trying to get on the campus and couldn't. And so, a lot of people look and go, well, if it's free speech, then why not just let it be free? Let everyone talk. And so if someone wants to come in and support the KKK, well, let them do it. If someone wants to come in and support, some Marxist communist view, let them do it. There's a problem with that, and I just want to touch on what that is historically. I don't know if this helps both sides understand the either. I'm not sure, but the Constitution defined free speech in the 1790s, and it allowed free speech, or thought of free speech as an avenue. This is typical of sort of late Enlightenment thinking, that creates objectivity or neutrality by opening the ground to all contributors. Right. So if you have 10 people, you can try to craft what objectivity might look like, and say, well, if this person speaks, and just open the ground, let everybody speak. And now it's neutral. And it's not going to be neutral in the sense, everyone's going to have their opinion, but the space, that public space, that arena where everyone's talking is neutral because everyone has a chance to share their voice. And so free speech provided for neutrality and, as close as you could get to it, objectivity. You can't figure out what objectivity is first and then enforce it. That's sort of French revolutionary thinking. But rather, you procedurally create space for everyone to talk, and then everyone speaks into it, and then that's as close to objectivity as we're going to get. That worked largely in the 1790s up through, it started to fall apart in the 1870s and 80s, and you could even say pre-Civil War, because largely in the 1790s we had a shared Judeo-Christian culture, and in that culture everyone had the same basic views. And because of the same basic views, everyone then spoke their opinion on those into that space. What happens when we get into the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and finally the 20th century is it turns out that we don't have one shared culture. There's not one basic view of life. Now, when and how that happens is open for debate, and I don't want to say. We could say there are minorities that never had, and I think that's a key argument. Judeo-Christian cultural values also were white. They were part of a certain race of people who had certain advantages in society, or a way of living in society, a way of living economically. They had access to newspapers and these sorts of things. So the public space was always free, but the question is who accessed it. In 1923, there was a Supreme Court case called U.S. v. Caroline Products, in which a milk company was trying to supplement in milk certain fats and products to expand the capacity of their milk so you can get more bang for your buck, really. And they were selling it into poor communities, and the poor communities, of course, were buying it. And the question is, well, is that the freedom of the milk company to do whatever they want? You can buy or not buy their product. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, fine, but there are these groups which it labeled insular minorities in a famous footnote. Insular minorities. And these minorities are insulated. And what insulation means, it's a very interesting term, what it means is that they don't have the same access to the public square as everyone else. Now that concept throws into turmoil the idea of free speech. Because if free is everyone speaking, what if people, some of them, because of their status in society, because of their education or whatever it might be, don't have the capacity to actually speak into that free space? So now, is free speech actually guaranteeing objectivity and neutrality? In other words, is it allowing for all the voices to be heard so that people can choose this way or that way? Or is free speech, that arena controlled by the majority and those in power, insulating certain minorities and groups that can't actually speak, in which case society is not open, it is not neutral, rather it's controlled, biased by the group of the majority. And so that concept in 1923, or that sort of a footnote, was part of a move to say free speech does not guarantee objectivity for the public or neutrality. In fact, what it does is simply provide the majority a chance to enforce its opinions. And so the tension then became between what free speech says It guarantees everyone the right to speak freely. And the outcome it produces, which is a biased public square. And so the Supreme Court, for example, in its decisions in Everson, and then finally in the 1960s in Lemon v. Kurtzman, and all the decisions about schools, and then also about 10 Commandments in front of courthouses and all that, decided that free speech, in a sense, isn't enough. Free speech does not guarantee that everyone has the right to speak. And so what we need to do, in fact, is start promoting neutrality. Neutrality is the goal of the First Amendment. The First Amendment just doesn't get there. In a society now that contains at least one, if two, if not more cultures. You've got minority cultures racially and ethnically, and you've got intellectual cultures like secularism, agnosticism, Islam, Christianity. So now the free speech concept, and this is where it gets funky, free speech has been termed now the effort to create neutrality. And once you think that way, then someone that speaks in agreement with the majority is not speaking freely, but they're speaking to enforce the bias of the majority. Does that make any sense? So now what one group calls free speech, everyone should have the right to speak. The other group says, no, if the majority speaks, all they're doing is enforcing the will, desire, and opinions of the majority, and again, insulating the minority who can't speak. And so they don't want free speech, they want neutrality, a neutral environment where everyone has the freedom and the right to speak openly so everyone can hear you. So for Ann Coulter, for example, to go to a college campus, she's going to say these things which are perceived to be, again, I think that's an important part, perceived to be the opinion of the majority. In fact, then that's not free speech. Well, it is technically, they're free to speak if Ann Coulter speaks there. But it's not free speech in its goal, which is to create neutrality. Really what this group wants, the group on the left side of this conversation wants, is to contrive some sort of public space where the minority-majority are balanced out, and the voices of the groups, specifically not individuals now, but groups, have the right to have their voices heard to the same volume and the same frequency as the majority. And so free speech is very much a political tool or weapon, depending on how you look at it now, that's used to clear space in the public square to get the majority out or to reduce them down to common size and allow every other group, LGBT community, African Americans, Muslims, whatever group is other than the perceived majority, whether it is or isn't, I think we can argue from time to time, to make sure they have the room to get in and speak also. Herbert Marcuse talked about this in the 1960s. He called it repressive tolerance. And what he said was, tolerance is not just tolerating everybody. That sounds like a nice thing, but the majority being tolerant, right, simply gives them control. What you need to get actual tolerance is you need to repress the majority so that the minority can finally have their voices heard. So the First Amendment, I think, as brilliant as it was as a legal construct for the 18th century, falls into really complicated, convoluted usages in the 20th century when you now have multiple cultures now all vying for that public space. And whoever controls the public space, the argument is, controls politics, their influence goes out into the media, and then they get to control what people think and hear. And that's why we're very concerned about money in politics. There's a lot to say about that. I hope that explains why we're struggling with this concept of free speech. Let me say also that part of the debate, part of the confusion anyway, is to misunderstand, I think, the power of words. That we kind of think now that if someone says something, so if Sarah Palin puts a target, that's a visual word, on a district, then someone has the right to shoot Gabby Giffords in the head. I don't think it quite works that way. I think there's something else in the heart of man that generates violence and evil. It's not just that they're sort of blank slate neutral waiting for someone to say a word or a bad thing and then they go respond. So I'm not sure that hate speech leads to hate action. I think that's been overblown. We have to rethink of our epistemology and I think our social environment better to reconfigure that. But that's secondary to my point here. My point here is just that free speech now is an effort to create environmental neutrality, and which means that you cannot have free speech to accomplish that. You have to have controlled speech to make sure that every group has the right to speak the same amount. The Constitution is a wonderful document in a lot of ways, but it's not able to quite handle that until we reconfigure what free speech looks like, or neutrality, or a neutral public square, or whether even a neutral public square is even possible. My argument is it's not. But that's a point maybe for a later recording.